even an optimistic view of the world would be reasonably pessimistic at this point of time. It's a little bit like watching your kid go out of the country and you have an interest, you have a sense of pride. This would become the premier India-Australian forum. Let me first say that at this time it's important we all appreciate that the larger outlook, see the world, is one of great uncertainty, a lot of unpredictability, new players, new behavior. And by the way, I'm talking about the Delhi test between India and Australia. This applies to some degree to the world scenario as well. If we put together the cumulative impact of 3 years of COVID, the damage that it has done to the global socio-economic fabric, year of the Ukraine conflict, the knock-on effects, the fuel, food, fertilizer, trade disruptions, the shortages it has created, the uncertainties it has enhanced. And then take some of the perennial challenges which pre-existed. There are also growing concerns about financial sustainability. I think there are more than 70 countries who have or are engaging the IMF in terms of stabilizing their national finances. Unlike in the near past, many of these are not low-income countries. Some of them are middle-income countries. So even an optimistic view of the world would be reasonably pessimistic at this point in time. If there is today really an urgent collective task, it is how to de-risk the global economy. Over-dependence on manufacturing, over-dependence on energy, over-dependence on services. So how do we create more reliable and resilient supply chains? How do we ensure at least the minimal trust and transparency? We cannot be agnostic about data in the manner in which we were mistakenly agnostic about products. For us to pretend that all nations are the same, and it's none of our business what happens inside, I think that era is now behind us, and we must not just accept it, we must actually be aware of it and make plans to deal with this. This applies as well to green technologies. We should not end up in a world where our desire to be greener leads us to be more dependent on a few and therefore more insecure. If I were to pick 3 words to the state of our contemporary world, those 3 words for me would be, number 1, globalization. Because globalization has worked, it's had its problems, it's had its downsides, but it's had actually an enormous impact, both the pluses and minuses, on global society. Globalization actually has helped to create a rebalancing. G20 itself is proof of that rebalancing, that till 2008, the global leadership such as it was seen as G7. I use G20, but I would not stop at G20. I use that as a metaphor to underline the point that if you look today at the production and consumption centers of the world, they are vastly different, certainly from what they were in 1945, but I would say almost every decade it's very useful to actually see a decadal chart of who's up and who's down and how the balance is. United States, to my mind, has been the premier power in the foreseeable future. I still see it as the premier power. And clearly the rise of China, the share of China in global economy, in global technology, in global influence, these are undeniable factors. But the fact is that clearly going to see many more powers who will have more influence on global debates and global outcomes than they did before. And to my mind, certainly some of them would be sufficiently separated from the rest of the herd to be seen as a pole, and therefore you will have multipolarity. Since Brexit, there's obviously been a very intense global debate about globalization, and President Trump's election sort of intensified that debate, if I can put it that way. Debate within the democratic world, which is really whose democracy, whose values, whose definition, whose norms. Because here too, the transformation of the world, the rebalancing, a lot of it derives from an era of, I would say, a G7 dominance, a very Euro-Atlantic view of what is democracy. The fact that democracy is perceived as a global aspiration is actually because India chose to be a democracy at the time of its independence. And because the first country which was decolonizing, and it happened to be the largest country which was decolonizing, chose a difficult democratic path. And then, despite decades of adversity and limited resources, stuck to that path. And stuck to that path when actually other democracies questioned the viability of that path. That today is very much, I think, at the center of a debate and a conversation that we must have on democracy. That there are practices and beliefs and cultures which are relevant to how democracy is actually executed and improved. My next point, of course, is the welfare of the world. And here again, the fact that the capacities of some countries are not what they used to be is a very relevant factor. I particularly refer here to the United States. For me, the big change in the last decade is not that the US capacities are relatively less than what they used to be. It is that the US is actually getting into a mindset where it's aware of that limitation and is open to working with like-minded partners to address it. And like-minded partners include countries who are not treaty allies. Now, in Australia, it's not a change you will readily realize because you are a treaty ally. For you, working with the United States is not anything new. It's part of your history for the last 80 years. For us, it is. So, and it's, certainly I would emphasize that there have been big changes in our foreign policy. But I would equally stress that there's been a big change in American thinking. That this is not the same United States with which we dealt with in the 60s or 80s or even, frankly, in 2005. That there is an evolution out there, and that evolution today you can see on a whole range of issues. And as a result, we actually today have new strategic concepts, new geopolitical theaters, if you would, new mechanisms. And obviously the most notable of these in terms of, on a conceptual level, is the Indo-Pacific. At a mechanism level is the Quad. And the Quad to me is a very, very, it's an enterprise laden with a lot of significance. Because if you look at it, there's that Indo-Pacific space, 4 countries, not geographically contiguous at all, with an enormous amount of sea space and some land space between them, but who have in different ways overcome their own past outlook to forge something common in response to a perceived global and regional need. And it's an endeavor with which I happen perhaps to be associated more closely than most others. I'm still probably the only witness in office of the first effort in 2007. And I've seen it at various levels, from doing it as a permanent secretary to a foreign minister, and now we're seeing it at a summit level, and Australia will be hosting the summit soon. So it is, to my mind, a development of great consequence. And I would say that not just us, I look at the foreign policy of our other Quad partners as well. I think today it has a salience which very few would have predicted, perhaps even 2 or 3 years ago. So finally, let me end with a few thoughts on our G20 presidency. It's obviously an extraordinary opportunity. It's a great honor. It's a time when you have a certain convening power and an agenda shaping opportunity. But it's also, as I said initially, a particularly difficult juncture of world politics. The way the G20 works, it works as a troika. So the incoming and the outgoing are associated with the current chair. So we had some visibility, perhaps a little more than visibility, some role as well, a supportive role, when our predecessor chair, Indonesia, was holding that responsibility. So we know that last year was a real struggle. that the Ukraine conflict had very strongly polarized the G20. All of us worked very hard to find some kind of common ground on that issue. I believe that we did succeed finally at the Bali summit, and I really think an enormous amount of credit is due to Indonesian patience and creativity in that regard. But today, the rest of the world expects the G20 to address its concerns. Because the rest of the world actually, and the rest of the world is another about 180 countries, that they have real problems, pressing problems, deep concerns. And they think it is for the G20 as the top 20 economies of the world to show the direction, to come up with answers, to at the very least be cognizant and if not sympathetic of their concerns. So our hope is that we are able to steer the G20 in the direction in which it should go, to undertake the responsibilities, the remit with which the G20 was originally tasked, which was economic growth and global development. And we are doing this not as just as a shall I say, feeling the vibes from the rest of the world. We actually did it as a practical, empirical exercise in the month of January. We actually consulted 123 countries, and consulted means at the level of Prime Minister himself and cabinet ministers. We have a good sense today by asking the world, literally asking the world, saying, here we are with this responsibility. What is it which is uppermost in your mind? What is it which is your most pressing concern? And what can we do about it? So today, I just conclude by saying that I had the pleasure of meeting the Prime Minister this morning, of spending time with my counterpart, Penny Wong, this afternoon. I think from what I can see, the Australian view is very much aligned with the thinking which I have put forward. For me, this relationship is exceptionally important, and I can only underline that by the frequency of my visits, that it is exceptionally important. It would, for us, make a big difference in the G20, in the Quad, bilaterally, and I think regionally as well. You know, I'm coming here after spending 3 days in Fiji, so do bear in mind that the India that I represent today is also an India whose influence and interest and footprint is growing in the world. We feel we can be of utility and support in regions which may not be that proximate to us. So that too has been part of my conversations in Australia. So once again, I would thank both ASPI and ORF for providing me the opportunity to share some thoughts about our relationship, about my visit, but most important, to show you the first trailer about what's going to happen in Raisina Dialogue. Thank you very much.